All right, everyone. Welcome back to the Stoa. And let there be light in the Stoa. Feel free to turn on your camera. It's going to be going to have a Q&A portion. And yeah, Thumos Awareness Week continues. Today we have Douglas Cairns with us. Douglas is a professor of classics at the University of Edinburgh with a focus on Greek society and ethics, especially the emotions and how they are reflected in Greek epic, tragedy, and lyric poetry. And I invited Douglas to the Stoa because he's put some good work and thought into Thumos. And today he'll be discussing it through the lens of Homer. And if you recall, on Monday, we had a jazzy take on Thumos from an integral metamodern perspective. On Tuesday, we looked at Thumos through the lens of Plato and how it's a part of the psychic part work of the tripart soul. And yesterday, we looked at it through the lens of Aristotle as a form of desire associated with anger, honor, and shame. And today, we're coming home to some Homer. And as Douglas put it, no post-Homeric author can rival the range of the Homeric presentation of Thumos. So I'm quite excited about today's session. Perhaps we can tie a lot of the threads that we were talking about this week together today. So I'm going to take in Douglas in a moment. He's going to present. And if you have any questions anytime, pop them in the chat. I can call on you. You can ask your question to Douglas. This will be on YouTube. So if you don't want to be on YouTube, just indicate that in the chat and I can read your question on your behalf. So that being said, Douglas, welcome to the Stoa.
Okay, thanks very much, Peter. It's great to be able to address you all. The Thumos week has been great so far. So first of all, my apologies that there's no Plato or Aristotle in my talk. It was just overambitious to think that I could talk about them as well as Homer in the limited time available. There will be lots of things, though, that complement the papers that we had yesterday and the day before on Plato and Aristotle. So if you heard them, I think you probably find quite a lot of complementary, contrasting, and interesting comparisons there to make. So I'll just share my screen and then we can get going. There we go. So if everyone can see that, let me go back to the beginning. So I guess you've all heard quite a lot about Thumos this week. It's been the topic of discussion. But if you'd never heard the word before and heard it for the first time, you still might think it sounds quite familiar because Thumos is very closely related to the Latin word fumos, or the French word fume, fumo in Italian. So smoke. And Thumos is one of quite a few words in Greek that associates psychological activity with things like air and breath. And another one of those things is psyche, or psyche, as we sometimes say in modern English. So this is the word that we conventionally translate as soul. But psyche comes from a family of words that refer to coldness. And in the Homeric poem, psyche is associated especially with the passage from life to death and things like that. By contrast, Thumos suggests heat rather than cold. In a dialogue by Plato called the Cratylus, Socrates derives it from a verb thuein, which means to rage, not from the alternative verb thuein, which means to offer a burnt sacrifice. But in that place, Socrates also explains Thumos in terms of boiling, zesis, of the psyche. And this zesis is a recurrent term in descriptions of what it feels like to be motivated by Thumos, both in popular and in philosophical sources. And this link between Thumos and breath is clear in Homer. So people and animals breathe out their Thumos when they die. Thumos is breathed out, leaves at the point of death, or is said to be lost in death. The killer, the person who kills you, or the disease that kills you, or something like that, can also be said to remove your Thumos. Now, interestingly enough, the psyche, of course, also leaves the body on death, and the psyche leaves the body when people faint as well. And in fact, Thumos and psyche can both be said to leave the body at the same time together both when someone dies and when they faint. So yeah, there are cases where, as I say, the thumos and the psyche are breathed out in death or when somebody faints. But there are also some of those passages where those two things are breathed out, but the thumos is breathed back in. And this maybe reflects a difference between psyche and thumos, in that psyche is the life you lose, whereas thumos is the life you live, the vigor of the life that you live. But anyway, that's breathing and living. The functions of thumos in Homer go far beyond that, far beyond breathing and living. And the mechanisms by which they go beyond these things are metonymy and metaphor. So metonymy is the mechanism through which aspects of physical bodily experience that are felt to play a role in mental functioning come to serve as ways of referring to types of mental functioning. And we also have various forms of metaphor that take this further, especially by turning processes like living and breathing and thinking and so on into objects, turning them into things, reification, but also sometimes turning them into agents by personification. So by metonymy and metaphor, Homeric thumos is implicated in a wide range of mental functions, sometimes as an agent, sometimes as a substance, as we've heard already this week, that hardens and softens. But sometimes thumos is also a thing that is an instrument, the thing by which the function is performed. Sometimes it's a container for the function, the place in which the function takes place. But one very important fact about Homer is that thumos isn't the only entity of that kind in the Homeric poems. A variety of parts of the body, including the heart, for which there are 3 different words, kradie, ator, and also care, and also this other thing called the phrenes, which might be the lungs or might be the diaphragm. These are also credited with mental functions in Homer. Not only in Homer is the range of these functions very wide indeed, it also goes completely across the normal divisions that we make between different mental faculties, the kind of things that we are familiar with in the taxonomy of mental faculties. So the functions of thumos and all these other things as well, phrenes and kradie and so on, include a wide range of different emotions. So the functions include the anger that's typical of thumos in later Greek, but also lots of other emotions as well, such as awe, benevolence, fear, grief, pity, wonder, the whole range. But the functions of thumos and these other things too also include things like forming beliefs, imagining the future, remembering the past, things like planning, deliberating, and motivating yourself towards goals that you desire. And thumos also is responsible for the desire for goals in itself. So very often generalizations about thumos in Homer start from later conceptions like Plato's, and then of course they find similarities, similar phenomena in Homer to what you find in Plato. But that's like the drunk man looking for his keys under the light because that's the best place where the light is. The point is that thumos in Homer does much, much more than it does in Plato, much, much more than it does in Aristotle. And it does most of these things alongside other psychic organs, parts of the body that have psychic functions that do the same things as well. So for a previous generation of scholarship, this was a scandal. So the existence of lots of names for psychic organs that referred to mental functioning was felt in itself to illustrate the primitiveness of Homeric concepts of self and agency. So this is the approach that Arthur Adkins, a British scholar who moved to the United States, summarizes succinctly when he endorses the claim that Homeric man has a psychology and a physiology in which the parts are more evident than the whole. So because you've got lots of names for body parts in Homer, you don't have an idea of the body. And because you've got lots of names for psychic parts in Homer, you don't have an integrated idea of the psyche either. More recent scholarship has made this completely untenable. And the major work in proving this is this one by Thomas Jahn. So Thomas Jahn has shown in particular, first of all, that each of these psychic organs is implicated in what are for us the three main areas of psychological functioning. So all of the psychic organs are involved in reasoning, feeling emotion, and in wanting things, desiring things, volition. And he's also shown, secondly, that in a very large number of more specific functions, things like deliberating, desiring, being afraid, being angry, being sad, and so on, there's no function that isn't represented by more than one of these things, and normally the functions are represented by several of these psychic organs. So he shows that these terms, when they're used of psychological experience, have the same function. They're functionally equivalent. And having shown that, he goes on to explain why that is the case. And the reason why it is the case is an interesting one. It's a metrical one. It's got to do with the spontaneous process of composing oral poetry in performance. And of course, the discovery of how Homer or the Homeric tradition composed oral poetry in performance is one of the great achievements, probably the greatest achievement of American classical scholarship in the work of Milman Parry. So the point is that in almost all cases, in the vast, vast majority of cases, these phrases, the phrases in which these psychic organs so-called occur, have different metrical shapes. So they fit different slots, different positions in the hexameter line of poetry in which Homer is composed. If each of these things, each of these names for the psychic organs, represented a different essential idea, as Parry put it, you'd expect there to be many cases of metrical identity, because there's no bar on having equivalent metrical shapes for things that mean different things. But instead of that, what we have is a flexible system of alternatives that embodies the two principles of formulaic composition according to Parry. The principles of extension, so you have all the formulas you need for different points in the line, but also economy. You typically only have one phrase for each particular point in the line. So oral poetry is conditioning the proliferation of different terms, but these terms form metrical functions rather than, let's say, semantic functions. Jahn also shows that the equivalence in function of these phrases, these terms, also entails in most cases an absence of specificity in the function. In particular, he demonstrates that when the words for the psychic organs like Thumos are used in cases which are not the subject case, so the accusative, the genitive, the dative, and so on, and when they're used with prepositions in phrases like in the Thumos, in the phrenes, in respect of the Thumos, in respect of the phren, in the phren and in the Thumos, all these formulas, these in fact add nothing to the verbs that they modify. So in normally, these don't do anything except fill a space in the line. But Jahn also emphasizes that this isn't true in absolutely every case, even of these prepositional or oblique case adverbial uses. There are what he calls pregnant cases. Pregnant in German means something like meaningful, meaning-laden. And in these cases, the reference to internal psychological functioning isn't redundant, it's pointed. It's got a particular point. So, for example, if we take words for joy and pleasure, forms of the verb to rejoice cheirein are found with the thumos, with the phrein, with the care, the heart, the ator also means heart, and without any of these things. So normally, phrases like he or she rejoiced with the thumos or rejoicing in the thumos simply specify in a redundant pleonastic way that the internal psychological event of rejoicing is an internal psychological event. But the adverbial phrase with the thumos, in the thumos, and so on can be meaningful. So in this passage here in Odyssey 22, after he's killed the suitors, his enemies, Odysseus tells the nurse, his old nurse, Eurycleia, rejoice in your thumos, old woman. Restrain yourself and don't cry out in triumph. So here the phrase in thumos is opposed to an alternative way of rejoicing, rejoicing audibly, making a noise, ololudstein, crying out. So here in thumo, in the thumos, identifies silent rejoicing as an inner psychological experience, something that you can't see, something that you can't hear. We see this kind of thing most obviously in cases like this, where we're dealing with things that would otherwise be visible or audible externally in terms of behavior. So there's another good example in Odyssey 20, where Odysseus, who's still in disguise, smiles with his thumos, me de sede thumo. So he smiles inwardly. We can't see him smiling, but he feels what a person feels when they smile. But even when these phrases are used with verbs that actually do denote inner psychological experience, the phrases in question can have this same force. They can specify that these are inner internal processes. But the point is, this function can also be performed by any one of the psychic organs. We get phrases that use phrein or phrenes that also specify interiority in the same way. They do it redundantly and they do it non-redundantly. So functionally, these terms constitute a single system. In their meaningful senses, in the pregnant senses, the phrases, as Jan puts it, are equivalent in function. But in the other cases, they are without function. They're functionslos, as he puts it. So he deliberated in his thumos means the same thing as he deliberated in his phrenes, and both of them just mean he deliberated, which is an internal psychological experience. So Jan's approach makes all these locutions, all these phrases refer to functions of a single entity, namely the human being, him or herself. They don't detract in any way from that individual's agency. But this conclusion, as you've just seen, rests primarily on his account of adverbial instances where the psychic organ is an instrument or a location for psychic functioning, that kind of thing. And these are by definition, because they're adverbial, cases in which a human agent is the subject of the relevant verb. So what happens when the thumos itself is the agent? What happens when the thumos itself is the subject or the object of a verb? So maybe this is where we'll find the breakdown of the personality, the plurality of agency that people like Atkins identified. Well, hardly. Let's take the example of deliberation. There are two Homeric verbs that mean to ponder one's options or to consider one's options. One is this one here, mermerisdein, and the other one we'll see in a minute is hormeinen. So mermerisdein occurs 41 times in the poems. In 38 of those, the subject of the verb is a human agent. In 22 of those, so the majority of those, there's no adverbial reference to a psychic organ. In the remaining 16, there is an adverbial reference, but it varies between the thumos and the phrein or the phrenes. I'm sorry, this is all in Greek, but basically you can see the word shapes and you can see that there are different words involved here. In only 3 cases is the psychic organ itself the subject. Is it the subject of the verb personify? We've got Thumos twice as the subject of the verb to ponder, and we've got ator, heart, once as the subject of the verb to ponder. With the other verb, hormeinen, we have 29 cases in total, and again, in the vast majority, 26, the human agent is the subject. In 11 of these, there's no reference to a psychic organ as an adverbial adjunct of the process of pondering. In the remaining 15, the adverbial phrase varies again between thumos on the one hand and phrein or phrenes on the other hand. And again, in a small minority of cases, the psychic organ, in this case, care, heart, is the subject. And so the standard Homeric way to refer to deliberation is to use the simple verbs mermeresdein and hormeinen, to ponder with the person as the subject. Deliberation is something that an agent does, and you don't need to specify that it is an internal psychological process, but you can if you want. Personification with these verbs of the psychic organ is comparatively infrequent. But when it occurs, it can be very striking indeed. The most striking example is the one that Josh, I think, discussed the other night, the barking heart of Odysseus, which is used by Plato in Republic Book 4. But that's such a great passage, it's also really complicated to discuss. So let's talk about a simpler one. So this is Book 9 of the Odyssey. Polyphemus, Odysseus is in the cave of the Cyclops Polyphemus, and Polyphemus has started eating his friends. This is the episode, in fact, that Odysseus looks back to in the barking heart episode in Odyssey 20. So this passage will help us show what's at stake in personification, but it also illustrates a degree of the range of psychic function that Thumos can be associated with in Homer. So let's have a look. The Cyclops has begun to eat Odysseus's companions, and at first, helplessness, amechanie, grips Odysseus's Thumos. So here we've got a particular mental state, amechanie, helplessness, taking hold of the Thumos, a part of the personality or something like that, in exactly the same way as a person would grip another person or a person would grip an object. But this is obviously not just an experience of the Thumos, it's a way of explaining how Odysseus himself felt at this moment. He didn't know what to do. The Thumos, if you look at the whole range of its uses in Homer, is regularly said to desire things and to issue orders about how to achieve those things. It's regularly got a strong motivational aspect. But here the motivational force is held in check, held fast by an opponent, amechanie. Amechanie being the inability to put motivation into practice. So in this case, the use of a verb that denotes physical manipulation of concrete materials involves personification of its subject and at least reification and possibly also personification of its object. So the language here is clearly and thoroughly metaphorical. But if this is a kind of metaphor that makes the Thumos a real agent, we'd also have to say that it makes amechanie, helplessness, a real agent. Amechanie is the subject and Thumos is the object. But if that was true, if the real agents here were amechanie and Thumos, we'd then have a problem to figure out. We'd have to figure out how this affects the agency of Odysseus himself, only a couple of lines later, when he plans in his great-hearted Thumos, there in line 299, to approach the Cyclops and kill him. So we've gone from a state of having no plan, but wanting one, which is attributed to the Thumos, to a state of having a plan, forming a plan, which is attributed to Odysseus. and the thumos is now in its regular adverbial role, indicating only that internal mental events take place in an internal mental space. You notice there in that line that the thumos is described as great-hearted. This is an adjective that you can also apply to people. So the adjective that qualifies the thumos also qualifies the person. Odysseus has a great-hearted thumos because Odysseus is a great-hearted person. And so you might say that thumos there is in synecdoche, part for the whole person. Anyway, the point here is that Homeric diction can say that what's going on here is an experience of Odysseus's thumos, or it can say it's an experience that happens to Odysseus in his thumos. Whichever way you look at it, the movement from helplessness to having the beginnings of a plan is clearly an experience of Odysseus as the an agent who makes sense of his situation in a holistically perceptual, imaginative, evaluative, desiderative, and emotional way. But then something interesting happens. If you look at line 302 there, a second thumos held me back, he says. Heteros thumos, heteros deme thumos erukain. A heteros thumos, a second thumos, restrained me. So he thinks, if I kill Polyphemus, we have no way of getting out of the cave. So here we've got one thumos confronting another thumos, because if the second impulse is a second thumos, a heteros thumos, the first one in which Odysseus entertained a thought in his thumos must be a thumos as well. So in this phrase, heteros thumos, second thumos, the thumos word means something like thought. By metonymy, a word that's regularly used in association with the overall process of thinking is now used for the outcome of that process. The process of thought leads to thought as a product. And by metaphor, that product, that outcome, is personified as the subject of a verb. It holds Odysseus back. And you notice as well that one impulse here is more impulsive than the other. But not only are the impulse to take revenge and the impulse not to take revenge, the better judgment that restrains that first impulse, equally a thumos, but each of these two thumoses has cognitive, affective, and desiderative aspects. They're both about plans and goals and wanting to achieve them. Each of them evaluates the situation, imagines a possible and desirable future, and provides a basis for action. The more reflective second thumos inhibits a hot-headed, passionate thumos, but in the terms of the way that this is represented in the language of the context itself, we actually have a sequence. The two thumoses don't come into direct interaction. Odysseus plans internally in his thumos to act before the second thumos restrains him. The two subpersonal entities, the first and the second thumos, don't interact with each other. They interact by means of their relationship with the agent, Odysseus. And this is the general pattern in the Homeric poems. The action and behavior of personified psychic entities is always mediated by their interaction with the human agent. You get interaction between person and thumos, not between reason and thumos. So this is different from Plato, where the elements of the psyche can directly interact with each other. However it's expressed, deliberation in Homer typically involves either two alternatives or reasoning to achieve an end. And these are typically expressed propositionally as indirect questions. So he pondered whether to do this or to do that, or he pondered how to do something else. And so the content of deliberation is at least implicitly discursive. It lends itself to formulation in terms of speech. And so the options available can be expressed not just by indirect questions, but also by direct speech. So Odysseus in this passage pondered in his frame and in his thumos, and then we get direct speech of what he was pondering. Whether this is actual speech or speech representing thought doesn't matter. It's perfectly clear that the thought that's in question here is Odysseus's own thought. And this is relevant when we come to cases in which, in some sense, the thumos is said to be a partner in dialogue. There are 15 cases in which deliberation is conducted by means of direct speech that's described by the narrator, the poet, if you like, as an address to the thumos. So we get either with human beings a phrase that says, vexed, he said this to his great-hearted thumos, or if the character involved is a god, the line is, shaking his head, he said to his thumos. In 4 of these speeches, the speech that's introduced by the narrator as an address to the thumos contains the line, but why has my dear thumos said this to me in conversation? In these cases, the speech addressed to the thumos becomes a speech that's attributed to the thumos. Both the human agent and the thumos seem to be playing both roles here. A human being, in every case a man, is said to speak, but then that man in his speech portrays himself as the listener. The thumos is addressed, but then the thumos is said to have spoken. There's only one passage of speech, but somehow there seem to be 2 speakers and there seem to be 2 listeners. So how do we explain this? Well, we explain it in the same way as we've explained everything else in this talk so far, functionally. A scholar called Hayden Pelliccia has shown that all the speeches in which a character is said by the narrator to address the thumos either have no one there as an audience and no one there in the speech as an addressee, or else they have no one there as an audience, and although they're addressed to someone, that someone is not meant to hear what's said. So there's no real addressee or audience here. The thumos in these speeches, in the speech introduction formula of the narrator, is just a sounding board for the agent's thoughts expressed as direct speech. In these passages here in Odyssey 5, you see this very clearly because we have the speech introduction, vexed, he said to his great-hearted thumos. Then we have the speech, and then the speech is concluded with the line, while he was turning this over in his frame and in his thumos. So talking to your thumos is the same as turning things over in your frame or in your thumos. Equally, the other line, the line that says, but why has my dear thumos said this to me in conversation, that occurs in a small subset of these speeches, isn't a real question. It's never answered. It's a rhetorical question. It just serves as the conclusion of the thoughts, the ruminations that were introduced by the narrator as an address to the thumos. But in fact, none of these speeches is addressed to the thumos by the actual speaker. All of these speeches, all these 4 speeches there, references at the bottom of the screen, begin a me. They begin o mo ego. So the narrator says that so-and-so, somebody addressed his thumos, but that somebody speaks only to himself. So these words that are clearly addressed to and spoken by the speaker himself are words that are then attributed to the thumos. So the thumos is neither an actual listener nor an actual speaker. It just does 2 conventional things, 2 conventional functions. First, as a sounding board for the speaker's deliberations, and then as the source of the alternative, which is rejected. So these are metaphors of self-division, metaphors of internal dialogue. The metaphor of thumos as a partner in dialogue doesn't really endow it with agency, and the metaphorical mapping that we have here from attributes of the person to attributes of a personification respects the limitation that all internal psychological experience is always some real agent's internal psychological experience. The purpose here is to model human mental processes, not to replace them with alternatives. The operative notion of agency here is human agency. Some people claim, but they shouldn't, that personification, which somehow undermines the notion of personal agency. But it makes no sense to claim that, because personification depends on taking the notion of agency that we find in everyday experience out there in the world, the empirical notion of agency, and mapping that onto things that aren't really agents, not literal agents. This can't undermine the notion of personal agency, because you need that notion to get started in the first place. Personification is only possible if you have a very robust notion of personal agency. We'll just conclude with one of these passages, the longest of them. This is Hector's monologue in Iliad 22. So Hector has made a big mistake. He was allowed one day of success while Achilles was absent from the fighting. But at the end of that day, when Achilles returns to the fighting, he stays outside the city. He doesn't retreat. He thinks he can win the war. So here we have the monologue that he speaks at that point. And in this case, the apparent dialogue with his Thumos clearly represents his own emotional state as he reflects on the situation. So the narrator says, vexed, he said to his great-hearted Thumos, but he in fact says, me. And then he begins to think about himself and his own experiences and his own dilemmas and his own options. You see, immediately he begins to use first-person verbs. So he addresses himself, me. He blames himself. He says, I've really fouled up here by my own recklessness. I've ruined my people. So he's got previous decisions in the past. He's an agent who extends from the past to the present to the future. And he blames himself for his past behavior. Now, because of that behavior, he weighs up his own options, which are options for him, and he comes eventually to a decision that, given his past mistakes, his present circumstances, and his future prospects, he regards as better for himself. So this is all from his point of view as an agent with a past, a present, and a future. It's a dialogue only insofar as Hector is debating possibilities with himself. And in fact, according to the Byzantine commentator Eustathius, it's the way that this monologue weighs up the pros and cons. Should I do this? No, you can't do that, because if you do that, this will be the consequence. It's all of that that makes it dialogue-like, and so justifies the use of the verb to say in conversation, in that line there highlighted in yellow. Why has my dear Thumos said this to me in conversation? So the involvement of the Thumos here does not detract in any sense from Hector's own awareness of agency and responsibility. And it shouldn't detract from our sense of Hector's agency and responsibility either. So to sum up, it's characteristic of all the various uses of Thumos in Homer, whether as a personified agent, a reified container for thoughts and emotions, or in various other types of locution that specify modes of thought and emotion. It's characteristic that there should be some sense of the motivational force of the impulse in question. Though Thumos is implicated in a very wide range indeed of thoughts, beliefs, desires, and emotions, these are typically thoughts, desires, and emotions that focus on opportunities, or what some people call affordances, for action. The impulses that the Thumos helps represent can be completely in harmony with the agent's plans and goals, but they can also be in conflict with the agent's plans and goals. The Thumos itself can be the force that holds you back and subordinates short-term emotional satisfaction to long-term goals. But equally, it can be the kind of thing that rational agents need to control. It can be both long-term motivation and short-term motivation. The thumos itself can be divided over what to do, but very often the agent and the thumos work together in deciding what to do. Interaction between the person and the thumos takes place and is represented in lots of different ways, and the thumos represents a whole spectrum of functions. But the other psychic organs similarly operate also across this spectrum. It's just that thumos is the dominant one. It's more than twice as common as any of the others. It's the prototypical one, and it's the most versatile one among these psychic organs. So in none of this is there any reason to conclude that the coherence of the thumos as a concept, a coherence that involves perception, judgment, belief, desire, and emotion, detracts from the coherence of the Homeric notion of the person as agent. So it's not the case that the thumos is now an emotional thing, now an irrational thing, and now, by contrast, a rational or reflective thing. The way that the thumos is represented reflects a view in which cognition and affectivity, cognition and emotion, are intrinsically linked as aspects of a person's inner life, moral character, and ways of making sense of the world. As an internal substance, an internal space, an internal object, or an internal agent associated with processes of cognition, emotion, volition, and motivation, the thumos isn't a scandalous ragbag of capacities that should be kept separate. It's a concept that links reason and passion, belief and desire, mind and body, intentional and phenomenal, in ways that recognize, at least implicitly, the unity of cognition with affectivity and motivation as embodied functions of a single human organism. So apologies again for not getting on to Plato or Aristotle. Here are some publications of mine, if anyone's interested, in which I do discuss Homer, Plato, Aristotle, and other things too. So very happy to take any of these points up in questions.
Awesome.
Thanks very much.
Thanks so much, Douglas, for providing us that Homeric download of Thumos. So if anyone has any questions, feel free to pop it in the chat, and I'll call on you and can ask your question to Douglas, and I have one or two myself. So yeah, what's coming up is like a tension that often happens at the Stoa is between what's called like boundary work and boundary play. And boundary work is a term we riffed from like sociological science studies. And how I hold it is it's having a really robust understanding of a discipline or a concept, what it means, its history, how it relates to other concepts, how it sees through the lens of different thinkers. And so it's like sensing into the contours and boundaries and protecting those boundaries via argument. In contrast, boundary play is like, how playful can we be with those boundaries? Like, how can they be expanded? They can be stretched, what ingredients added and taken away, like breathing life into it, essentially. And a word like thumos is interesting because given its common, like lack of common use, it feels up for grabs and invites boundary play. Or at least for people at the Stoa, it invites boundary play. So I'm curious if you have any comments on that framing. And my question is, given that framing, what do you sense is the potential of the word thumos as a living word, like how it can be used, misused, redeemed, or repurposed?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's quite a lot of that boundary play in Homer. So there are lots of locutions that occur only once and that are clearly worked up from conventional materials. So all of this stuff is conventional, that's the point. So the background stuff is it's hundreds of years of tradition of using these words in certain fairly predictable ways. But you can also take that and do incredibly creative things with it. So the example that I didn't have time to discuss because it's worth twice as long a discussion in its own right from Odyssey 20 is just like that. So there you've got really quite a playful passage indeed in which Odysseus is pondering in his thumos, deliberating in his thumos, and getting aroused in his thumos because his maidservants who should be loyal to him are in fact sleeping with his enemies, the suitors. And he's in disguise in his own house, and he hears them laughing, going off to have sex with the suitors. And so he's completely riled up about this. But of course, the Homeric way of saying that is to say his Thumos is aroused. And he wants to kill them straight away. But he restrains that thought, and he restrains that thought by doing something that never happens anywhere else in Homer, addressing not his Thumos, but his heart. So he says, endure my heart. He says, you've endured worse things in the past. You endured worse things on that day when the Cyclops, Polyphemus, ate your companions. You endured something more dog-like, he says, because the heart has been barking like a dog, a completely unique simile there, like a mother dog defending her pups. So the idea there of aggression, but also protectiveness that we heard about the other day. So all of this is elaborately worked up into this unique way in which a character, for the only time in Homer, addresses a psychic organ. The psychic organ still doesn't respond, it doesn't speak, but then the psychic organ is persuaded to stop barking because it's reminded of its own experiences. And the own experiences are on the day when the Cyclops was killing your companions, but metis, intelligence, got you out of the cave. And metis is a play on words on the ruse that Odysseus used to get out of the cave when he called himself Utis, nobody. Utis in a declarative sentence becomes metis in a conditional sentence. And so there's a play on words there. But metis means intelligence. So that passage is making it absolutely clear that the cradie and its barking and metis and its intelligence are just ways of talking about Odysseus himself. But it's done in a very knowing way, which clearly refers to the poet's familiarity with the techniques that he's using, and with the sense that he's pushing these techniques to the very, very boundary of what is conventionally familiar and acceptable. So he's creating some kind of psychology there, using the forces of metaphor on the hoof.
Yeah, it's very cool.
And that's, of course, I think what Plato does. So Plato takes that passage and goes in a completely different direction with it, getting the tripartite soul, getting Thumos as a part of the tripartite soul out of it. So it can be very productive to use these fairly conventional images and metaphors to think with, to provide alternative models of mind and motivation.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. What's coming up is, like, it seems obvious now, but like the role of the philosopher is boundary work, the role of the poet is boundary play, and then Plato, like the philosopher poet. So he was
Absolutely,
sort of
that's right. Yeah,
that's cool. All right, so let's jump into some questions. Roman, you had a question. You can unmute yourself and ask it.
Hi, thanks very much for this lovely presentation. I was just thinking about Plato and Socrates. He describes Socrates as somebody who is in a dialogue with something, and he often he described this as some kind of a friend. I mean, Socrates himself, he often, he says that when he goes home, he's really never alone, because he's always with his friend.
Yeah.
And this is does this Thumos, could this relate somehow to this concept of daimonion, or this what Plato describes in the case of Socrates?
I think it's comparable in the sense that both of them are metaphors of self-division. So Socrates at least contains both himself and his daimonion, and the daimonion speaks only to him. And it, as he says, in fact, in the Apology, it always has his best interests at heart. It would warn him if he was doing anything wrong. The Thumos is kind of like that too. It's kind of like an internal advisor. Can be a wise advisor. It can be a foolish advisor. And of course, not Socrates, but the Athenian stranger in the Laws describes Thumos and things like that as foolish advisors. You shouldn't listen to them. But it's the same kind of metaphor, basically. And it's a metaphor we can't really do without. I think phenomenologically, lots of thought, at least if not all thought, presents itself to us as a form of internal dialogue, a form of internal speech. And if we have that, we tend to think of ourselves as both instances, both the speaker and the addressee. So we're splitting ourselves in some sense when we do that. And I think that's really all that's happening with these things, Thumos and Freyne and so on in Homer. They're ways of explaining some of the phenomenology, some of what it's like to have these mental experiences. And I guess, although the daimonion is said in Plato to be something that only Socrates has and no one else does, it's still within that general ballpark. It's the same kind of thing.
Thanks very much. Yes.
Awesome. Any follow-up question or share, Roman?
No, that's fine. Thank you.
So, thank you. Lizelle, you had a question.
It's hi, thank you, Douglas. It's not so much a question. That what popped into my mind is the research showing that we think better in dialogue than we think in monologue. And so I was thinking, will I be completely misreading Homer if I think like, oh well, that's actually a cool way to go back to the whole idea of
that's a really good point. Yeah, no, I should have put that in the paper. Actually, it would have made it much more relevant. That's absolutely right. So I don't know if you've read Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow. I guess you have.
Yes.
But he points out if you give people alternatives that they have to choose between, they tend not to make these often quite stupid gut reaction things on the basis of various misleading forms of heuristic. So if it's just how attractive does this seem, you go for it or you don't. If you're asked to compare it with something else and consider the pros and cons in a kind of dialogic way, you go into what he calls the system 2 mode of thinking, and you sometimes at least make better decisions. So, I mean, first of all, I think as in the answer to the last question, a lot of thinking is in fact carried out in what seems to us to be internal dialogue. But it's also, I think, the case that internal dialogue at least can be a mode of thinking that's productive in a lot of particular situations.
I was also thinking when you were answering the previous question, especially when we refer to the Thumos as foolish.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if I'm now throwing Plato on Homer, which shouldn't be done, but then also understand it almost as the lion part, right? That like the heart, our social, so not the reason. So if we can maybe explicitly make the reason talk to the Thumos, that could be maybe train.
Yeah, so lots of people think when Plato does that, he's trying to get rid of the person. So there's no room for the person. There's just reason, Thumos, and desire. I think if that's what Plato really wanted to do, he wouldn't have had all the passages that he in fact does have in the Republic, in which you've got those three things, but you've also got a person as well. So if you look very, very carefully, especially in books 8 and 9 of the Republic, you've got quite a lot of passages in which the person is said to act in various ways or to interact in various ways with his own reason. And so at the end of book 9, when you've got an image, so Plato says at the end of book 9, look, you guys, all the stuff I've been telling you for 7 books is metaphorical. And he says, let's make an image of the soul in words, and let's make it consist of something that looks like a person on the outside, but inside you've got a little person and a little lion and a many-headed beast. And then he says, what you've got to do, you people out there, is cultivate your inner person in the right way. So even Plato, at the end of that whole argument in the Republic, wants to have a role for the integrated personality as some kind of agent that can interact with the aspects of an integrated personality. And so even he's got that kind of dialogue between person and part, as well as dialogue between part and part. So there's a lot, actually, I think the influence of Homer or the influence of popular conventional ways of thinking there constantly reasserts itself and makes its way into Plato's thinking, Plato's way of writing about these things.
Thank you. We managed to sneak Plato in after all.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, how can we keep him out?
Exactly.
Talking about Thumos.
Do you have time for one more question, Douglas, or do you have a hard stop at the top?
No, sure, that's fine. Carry on.
And so this might be the last question. Robert, the man who influenced the series, you had a question.
Yeah, I was wondering for like further study, if you have any figures that are ancient or modern that might care or exemplify Thumos really well. And also, like, is there like a Christian Thumos? Like, does Christ exemplify Thumos, or like Athena, or where are some more
Yes.
ancient sources?
Yeah, so yeah, I mean, that's difficult. It's a difficult question to answer using the Homeric conception of Thumos, because in Homer, as I was trying to show, Thumos isn't one particular set of motivations. It can do just about anything. And so there are no particular heroes of Thumos or villains of Thumos. Everybody's, got Thumos in action every time they carry out internal mental processes. So I think it's later that it takes on substantive, motivational, characterological characteristics, especially with Plato. Heroes, examples of Thumos. Well, I mean, there are people like Euripides' Medea. If she's your cup of tea, she's certainly someone who makes a big deal out of Thumos and says that it's driving her plans, but her plans are maybe not the most brilliant plans in the world to emulate. So I don't know. I mean, the kind of people that are held up as paragons in the sort of moralistic tradition, like Socrates, like Christ, like Antigone, and so on, tend not particularly to be paragons of Thumos, especially. I guess Antigone is fairly strong on the Thumos side, but then, is she a role model? And as for Christianity, I think that would be a brilliant subject to investigate. So I suspect that in the Greek New Testament and in the Septuagint, Thumos just means something like fury or anger. But it would be really interesting to research that and write about it. But I'm afraid I just don't know myself.
Any follow-up question to share, Robert?
Yeah, I guess I wonder, like, if modern people are kind of aloof and more kind of materialistic, like how would someone that's really materialistic reconnect with their Thumos?
Well, I guess, given the way that Thumos is then filtered through Plato and Aristotle, we'd then be thinking of rejecting materialism, rejecting the idea that what should motivate us is just acquisitiveness, but instead we should be motivated by all the things that I think Thumos does denote, as we've heard over the last couple of days in Plato and Aristotle. So not just pride and standing up for yourself and all those kind of things, but, warmth and friendliness towards other people, recognizing other people's claims to personhood and autonomy and honor and all those kind of things. So, I mean, if Thumos is a good thing, it's because it circles in Plato and Aristotle around this notion of honor as the very most important aspect of selfhood and identity, but also interpersonal interaction. So in our project in Edinburgh, which I encourage you to look at on the web if you're interested, Honor in Classical Greece, we're exploring the idea that honor in Greece isn't just about one value. It isn't just about self-assertion. It's not just about manliness. It's about whatever happens when people come into interaction with each other and they have their own claims that they want to see recognized, but inevitably in interaction with other people, you have to recognize other people's claims too. So Thumos would come in there in realizing that everybody has an image to project. And if you want to project yours, you have to let them project theirs, and you have to rub up fairly well with each other and come to some kind of accommodation. So that's about much more than selfishly, individually getting on with earning your dough and ripping other people off.
Cool. Thanks, Robert. And yeah, so that about concludes this session in the Thumos Awareness Week. I quite enjoyed that. And yeah, Douglas, any parting words or thoughts you would like to leave us here at the Stoa today?
Well, just thank you very much for inviting me. You can never talk too much about Thumos, but you can't talk enough about it in half an hour. So there's lots more to be discussed. I'd recommend the Josh's book, Victor's article that he recommended yesterday. And if anyone's interested, I have some articles too. If you go to academia.edu, you'll find them there.
And I just put Douglas's article in the chat for people here at the Stoa. Yeah, so I'll make some closing announcements in a moment. But Douglas, thank you so much for coming to Stoa today. That was an awesome session. And perhaps we'll have another Thumos Awareness Week next year, and Christian Thumos, Buddhistic Thumos, all that good stuff. Next session at the Stoa, we're having a MJ PhD come in, a philosopher who created something called flash philosophy. So like flash fiction, like can philosophy be written in bite-sized pieces? So that's August 29th at 11 a.m. And then Thumos Bootcamp for Beyond Self-Discipline starts at September 3rd. So you can check that out on the link below. So that being said, Douglas, everyone, thank you so much for coming to Stoa today.